awakening to the moment. Address this moment with a sense of wonderment and innocence, for it is the doorway into your deepest joy.
Okay, so I'd like to begin this session with the following passage. Life isn't just about being positive or finding positivity. Being in the moment can help you remain calm if life starts to fall apart. A positive person is not always a realistic person. Being truly in this moment is about being honest and real with what is happening from one moment to the next. So when you say being truly in this moment is about being honest and real, what do you mean by that?
It's about giving up the fantasy of your mind. We have such a strong desire to escape the moment and to be entertained by the commentary of the mind. You know, being willing not to change what's happening around you. Being honest and real with it. Like this, whatever's unfolding in front of me, I need to accept it, or if I can't accept it, I need to be engulfed in this moment and not be engulfed in the fantasy of my mind. Often I would try to fit the moment in what I think it should be. So I would try to change the moment so that fit the concept of my mind. I'd reject what was around me because of what I thought the moment should be.
Okay.
So there was many times when I wasn't actually honest with what was happening. I would sort of ignore subtleties or certain facts about what was happening around me. Mm-hmm. And I think we do this with friends that sometimes we outgrow. We start to ignore the behaviors and the attitudes that are coming out of people that no longer fit into our lives. So we get a little bit out of context with the moment, and we're not really true and honest with what's going on in front of us. You know, sometimes I'd make up stories trying to accept what was happening, but my heart always knows, you know, what's really going on in this moment.
So like ignoring subtleties of what's going on around you. How subtle are these things, or are they actually quite obvious, would you say?
Okay, they're very obvious. And I think this happens a lot, like I say, in friendships where we outgrow a friendship, but we're ignoring what's going on, or we have changed and grown apart from our partner, per se, but we ignore, you know, what the heart really knows to be true. So we just ignore what's happening in our relationship. We ignore what's happening sometimes in our relationships with our coworkers, or, you know, or if somebody's at work and they're teasing another employee, sometimes we'll turn a blind eye to it, and we're ignoring what's actually happening in the moment. Mm-hmm. You know, to really be authentically in this moment, I think we have to be honest and interact with it appropriately.
Right. So like with friendships, sometimes, like with a partner, we'll start with that. With your partner, the stakes are much higher as to what is lost, especially if you're married. I mean, that then turns into quite a slew of inconveniences and money and hardships, as some people go through some pretty terrible divorces, right? Mm-hmm. But with a friendship, it's easier in a sense to cut that tie, cut that friendship. So I'm wondering, like, are people turning a blind eye because they don't want to deal with confrontation? Do you think that's what it is? Or do you think it's just because it's just easier to just ignore it and maybe it's not such a big deal? Like, do you think people undervalue, you know, the detriments of having someone around you, a friendship that isn't really suiting what's happening with you right now?
No, I think we stick around out of habit a lot of times.
Okay.
It's comfortable. We've been friends with somebody for a long time, or our behaviors are the way we act is the way we act, but it's not really, sometimes it's not in accordance to the moment unfolding. And that's kind of what I'm trying to point to, and being honest with and real with the moment is more about how authentically are we engaged in this moment? And the harassing a coworker is a really good example of this. If you work in an environment and if there's 100 employees and you think it's okay and acceptable to pick on one of those 100 people, you're sadly mistaken. And I think this kind of stuff happens a lot where we sort of defer responsibility in the moment, where because we're not really connected to the moment, we're not connected to the repercussions of what we say or what we do. And I think that we need to be linked and be responsible for our responses to life, and to take every moment and kind of be present with it. And if you're not in agreement with something, it doesn't mean that you need to have it move out of your life so much as maybe it's your time to say something. There's been many times where my honest and authentic engagement with the moment inspired me to say something loving, and that's another way of how we can get really honest with the moment. For instance, I was in a restaurant 2 nights ago, and the waitress that came to the table, I remember her coming into my store in Ingersoll, and I've always had this sense of a nice feeling around her. And I thought she kind of radiates a certain positivity. So my wife and my friend Joanne were all sitting down to dinner, and she happens to be our waitress. And so I let her know. I told her, I said, I've always observed you to be such a loving, positive person. I wanted to share that with you. It was sort of what was sitting on top of my heart. And then the next day, I got a message on my Facebook by her saying, it's really nice to hear, those simple words that you said, those simple little comments that you made, landed on me quite tenderly. So, and it was something maybe that she needed to hear in that moment. Not because she was weak, but she just needed to hear that. Mm-hmm. So an honest, authentic engagement with the moment at hand puts us more deeply into the wider parameter of what's in this moment.
That's interesting, because I wanted to know what some of the benefits were of staying in the moment, and something that I want to present to you as something that I feel anyways is what you just said in that example. Is a lot of people sometimes wonder how they can make themselves feel a little better as well. Because if you were to say those nice words to somebody, you're going to receive a benefit from that. You feel good about what you had just said. Or if you were to see somebody, I don't know, they're in a wheelchair and they're trying to get across the road, and something happens where their wheelchair breaks down and they're stuck in the middle of the road, or old lady with their groceries and she's struggling to get them into the trunk of her car, and you decide, I'm going to help her do that. These are all free things. They're easy to execute. It doesn't take really anything other than thoughtfulness and just reacting to what's in front of you. What would you say, besides just the fact that you feel good for doing that, what other benefits can someone experience from being more present in the moment?
More than you may realize. When you show up for your life, you start to become a big player. Your life radically changes when you show up for it. My life is much different now that I show up for my life. I'm not missing, so many moments in my life. I'm capturing all these subtle gifts and miracles that are surrounding me. My teacher used to give a talk about, and I've referred to this talk a few times, about his head not being in the same place where his body was at.
Okay.
So and I'll share this with you, and I think a lot of people can relate to this. Is he would get up in the morning, and before breakfast, his mind was already thinking about work. By time he got to work, he was already halfway through his day, if not all the way through his day. Then by the end of the day, near the end of the day, he was already, or halfway through his day, he was already home in his mind. And then by the time he got home at night, his mind was back at work. So his head and his body never showed up in the same place. And I think it's a pretty common scenario. And that's a classic illustration of how the mind wants for something different than what's unfolding now. And that's where the mind tends to interrupt this moment and beg for something different. And it's going to do that because that's what the mind does. But this moment, when we enter into this moment fully, and we put our heads and our bodies in the same place, we really begin to catch the sacredness of this moment. And it's not really, it's hard to convey this in words, and until you've actually become very present in your life, it's hard to put a lot of words around it. But I have developed a reverence for life because of my authentic engagement with the moment.
Now, is it, when you're describing the mind and the body being in two different places, is that just a product of being discontent with the moment because you don't like what's currently happening around you? Like, what if you really dislike your job, but you can't necessarily quit right now because you rely on that for your income, or certain things that hold you prisoner, in a sense, to these things that you find unenjoyable, that force you to either daydream, be absent in the moment, or thinking well ahead of where you are currently?
There's no mindset that's forceful other than the one that you're enforcing upon yourself. So when we learn the ability to be completely present, and this is where the benefits of the work of learning how to set down the mind again starts to enter our lives. You know, there's nobody sitting there forcing us to daydream. You know, it's a tendency, again, it's a tendency of the mind to want something different. If we learn how to engage the moment at hand, we might find that the moment is different than we maybe otherwise thought. Washing dishes can be a very pleasant experience. Please don't let my wife hear this portion of the audio. She tends to always be the one doing them. But no, if we engage in the moment, really engage in the moment, sometimes the most mundane tasks can transform. And I experienced this when I used to work at the factory, because I always felt like I wanted to escape when I worked in the factory. So that it was a classic example of I wanted to be somewhere else, but I was stuck in this hot, stinking cardboard factory. So what I started doing, and because this is a time when I first met the Ashayas, and I was learning how to meditate. And so one of my jobs was, I used to be a stacker. I would stack bundles of boxes. And so I would practice becoming intently present. I would see the bundle, I would feel the bundle in my hands, and then I would be conscious of just moving the bundle like it didn't weigh anything. And I would it was almost like became like a Zen art, stacking these bundles. I'd stack them really perfect, and I would just be really alive and in the moment with each bundle that came to me. Now, after a couple thousand bundles of cardboard boxes, there's nothing entertaining there. But no. I could suddenly start having a great time. I could have the time of my life while I'm stacking boxes. And I remember doing this a lot when I worked in the factory. The fastest way to almost like escape the difficult experience of having to be there was to put myself there fully. not the funny, kind of an oxymoron. So what I was actually escaping was my mind. When I become completely present, that, my mind disappeared. And that's one of the qualities of really being completely present in this moment, is that the mind no longer becomes the object of your affection. There's too much happening around to be distracted by the limited chatter and perspective that the mind offers.
It's funny because I would think that in order to enjoy your experience stacking boxes, you would have to use your mind to cultivate a positive feeling inside yourself that makes you content doing that. So you might think of things like, well, I drove here today in a nice car. I'm alive. I can breathe. I can talk to people. This weekend I'm going to the cottage. I got a wife at home that I love spending time with, and in 3 more hours I'll be there. Like some people might use positive thinking to get their way through a day, but what you're saying is don't think at all, just be present.
Well, when I became fully present, if there were thoughts, I wasn't aware of them anymore. I just completely put all my attention on what I was doing. And it was such a beautiful experience. I remember these times when I could really be present in the factory. So, and now I try to constantly stay in that space of being present. What's around me? What's going on? And again, so walking down the street, you never know what life's going to present. And that's one of the greatest qualities of living deeply in the moment, is you have no idea what's coming next. And that's great, because it makes life an adventure.
Yeah.
I don't know what's around the corner.
Absolutely.
And why would I want to? Because there's so much good stuff happening right now that why would I ever need to leave this moment?
So that's a great way to start this session, Awakening to the Moment. We just talked about a few things about how to stay in the moment. Now, talk to me about what losing touch with the moment might be about.
We lose touch with the moment as soon as we become overengaged with the mind and our emotions. And it's only the mind that pulls us, and our emotions that pulls us out of this moment. The moment doesn't cease to exist when we don't engage it or become present in it, but we just lose track of what's really at hand. So when we lose touch with the moment, it just means that we're just wrapped up in thoughts and feelings, and they're insignificant compared to what's unfolding right now.
And you did talk about in quite a bit of detail about staying in the moment. And I brought up the fact that what if we use our minds to facilitate positive thinking, et cetera, et cetera. Is there any other suggestions that you could provide to help us stay anchored in the moment when our mind starts to run amok?
Yeah, you can. There is breathing techniques. I know a lot of people have employed slow breathing. Squared breathing is something they teach at the police academy. Okay. At the police college. When you take a 5-second breath in, hold for 5 seconds, 5-second breath out, hold for 5 seconds. So that's squared. They call it squared breathing. And alternate nostril breathing, where you breathe in through one nose and then out through the mouth. And, there's different types of breathing techniques. But the biggest thing about the way to stay alive and fresh with the moment is to start to practice it. Bring this into your daily life. And one of the things that I was taught by this master showed up in my life one day, and I've got a crazy story about this later on. I'm going to save that one for a little bit. But this master showed up in my life, and he taught me that when I go to bed each night, run through my day. just do a quick run through your day and try to think of everything that happened in your day and see how much you remember. So that's a good indication on how present you were throughout the day. So, and this is another technique that I didn't really share this in the book.
Okay.
But it's another technique that you can do to learn how to become more authentically engaged with the moment. So if company leaves the house, review what the company said. If you're having a conversation with someone, be very present with the idea when they leave, I'm going to try to recall what they said to me. You can do this with your day, with an hour of your time, and it's a practice to learn how to engage the moment further.
That's really interesting. Yeah, because you didn't mention that in the book, but that's very compelling, because as soon as you said that, I just quickly kind of threw my Rolodex for today, recalling how my day went. Mind you, a lot of how my day went was spending it with you in this room doing interviews. Mm-hmm. But there might be like little intricacies that I've forgotten, little wee things that might take me a moment or two to actually recall. But that's a really good tip. I like that a lot. Now, you say in the book, this is a line of text that says, "What's happening in this moment is no accidents. So are there no accidents in life?"
Okay, this is a very complex question. There's a fair bit of information to answer that properly. There's a great deal of factors that create your life. And so the first part of my answer to that question is we think of life a lot of the times as, and there's a lot more talk of it these days, but we talk about karma. Okay? So when you think of karma, you think of just this blanket of cause and effect in your life. And you say, well, as you do bad things will eventually come back to you. However, karma, there's different lines of karma running independently in your life. There's several karmas working all together simultaneously. This is something that I've intuited out of my own experience, or learned out of my own experience from my own empirical knowledge, and just intuited out of my heart. So there's the karma of your destiny. You came into this world with a purpose and a reason, and so that has its own karma that needs to be executed over the duration of one's life. And if you believe that we have more than one life, then it needs to be executed over the duration of all your lives. So that's karma of your destiny. You have karma of your body. So your body has its own independent karma that's independent of your life's destiny's karma. And then you have the karma that results from the choices and the creations in your life. So these are three lines of independent karma that are simultaneously working in your life. So your body's karma, I remember asking my teacher about why do good people get cancer? And I think this is a question that a lot of us, when people that we know, that we admire and look up to and aspire to be like, when they get sick, you sort of question your faith a little bit, and you say, well, why them? Why not the person who's committing crime or harming children? Why don't they get cancer? Can't we just give them cancer make everybody else healthy? But the thing is that our body has its own karma. When we come into this body, we knowingly accept the karma that's happening in the body. And it doesn't matter how good you are, you have your own body's karma to work out. So that sort of gave a lot of answer to me why good people get sick. So, when people get sick in their life and you say there are no accidents, well, what about cancer? I think we ultimately know. And so that's one portion of it. Your consciousness is also a factor. Your degree of consciousness creates a field or a range of potentials to show up in your life. So within your level of consciousness, you have your highest potential and your lowest potential. And in a higher state of consciousness, like when you're making choices that are loving and positive in alignment with your purpose, then the result of your life is the result of those choices and the result of your level of consciousness. And so within your range of consciousness, we sort of point ourselves in different directions, and the more conscious we become, the further and wider our reach is into life. And we can shoot in both directions, in a positive direction or a negative direction. There's also a fact that the mind perceives things as good and bad. The mind has an idea of what misfortune is and what luck is and what is good fortune. Our misfortunes may not be nearly as bad as we tend to think they are. Sometimes terrible things happen, and as a result from those terrible things happening, something really positive comes into our lives. Mm-hmm. So again, are there accidents? If I break my leg, maybe there's a wider range of purpose involved in that, and I've drawn that into my life because I was going to go on to meet my perfect mate at the rehab clinic.
Yeah,
who knows?
right.
Like, and that's the thing about life. It's so random, and it appears to be so random, but all these moments start happening in our lives, and we can't make sense of it. So we say that's bad or that's good. It reminds me of the metaphor I used in the book about good news, bad news. Who knows? And do you remember reading that part of it? Mm-hmm. So, I guess I might as well share the story. There was a farmer, and his horses one day run away, and his neighbor comes over yelling and saying, no, your horses have ran away. What terrible misfortune this is. And the farmer just kind of shrugs, and he says, I don't know, good news, bad news, who knows? And his neighbor just can't make any sense of that. Like, he needs these horses to plow his fields. So then the next day, he looks out his window, and his horses have returned, and they've led 3 wild stallions into the yard. And his neighbor comes over, and he's like, oh my goodness, what great news, your horses returned with more horses. And the farmer's like, I don't know, man, good news, bad news, who knows? And so the next day, his son is out breaking these wild horses and falls off and breaks his leg. And again, the neighbor's like, oh my God, this is such terrible news. This is your only son, and you need him to help. And the farmer's like, look, hey, good news, bad news, who knows? And then the day after that, the military comes to take his son away to war, but he can't go because his leg's broken. Good news, bad news, who knows? And that sort of illustrates the point where sometimes our misfortunes are actually pretty good for us. And there's another layer to this, is that one thing that I never put much stock in was angels. We hear about angels, and a lot of the New Age spiritualists, are into angels, and I thought it was just this big, airy-fairy, fluffy thing. What I've come to realize in my life is that sometimes we get these little nudges. And from my understanding now, it's angels. Sometimes there's angels kind of just pushing our chin to look left, look right. Mm-hmm. These little nudges that we get, there's angels lining up moments in our lives. And I'm not trying to convince anyone to believe in angels or to go out and buy angel cards or to do anything. But I do feel that some things are in accordance to a much bigger plan. And, the last thing that I'll introduce, which really messes the mind up, is that future moments sometimes show up early. And we can't make sense of it. So future moments are happening in the past. And so this moment here now is the past of the future. So sometimes things that are going to happen down the road start to happen before they actually happen. which just blows my mind. It blows most people's minds, but it happens because life is not a linear event that's trekking forward. And we talked about this in the first session. Mm-hmm. Life doesn't unfold like A to B to C. The mind only assembles life to appear that it's unfolding in such a manner.
That's quite an illusion, eh?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's what most people would assume is the truth, is that our life works in a linear progression.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other thing I want to ask you about in regards to the accidents, the good news, bad news, sometimes you hear whenever challenges come up in people's lives, sometimes they're almost uncanny what the challenges are to test a human being. And they're very specific to their weaknesses, and maybe that's a chance for growth. Can you unpack that a little bit? Like, is there something to what I'm coming up with here? Because this is off the top of my head right now. But
well, we tend to manifest what's in our range of consciousness, and that's where how our consciousness affects what's happening in our lives. So if I'm entertaining thoughts about my phobias and fears and my misfortunes, I may draw more of that into my life. And this is sort of the premise of what I was talking about in the New Thought movement. So there's sort of a build-up and a power to all the things that we place our attention on. So, and that's why it's so important to learn how to direct your focus. And in the spiritual life, where we start to wake up and become succinct with the moment, and our focus becomes laser sharp, we can start to manifest our reality in an exponential rate. Things start to fly into our lives, and that's certainly what I have been observing in my life, is that the longer I sharpen my focus and narrow my thoughts into one direction, the faster the results start to show up in my life. So if you're thinking about terrible, awful things, you may be a magnet to be drawing in more of such things to happen in your life. Now, thankfully, when I was very unconscious, my mind was so scattered, and my direction and ability to focus on anything really was non-existent. So there seemed to be a buffer of time where I would cancel out a lot of things. But that's the importance of, as you move further and further down the path and get better at sharpening your focus and your attention, that you might want to think about where you're pointing yourself, because that's your trajectory becomes a very real and powerful thing to play with.
Now, would you say that there's a direct reason why some people become so numb to life and in the moments that happen? Why aren't more people elated by the gift of life?
We become numb in life when we're trapped in our minds and our emotions. And we sort of internally shut off, and we fix all of our attention on the mind. And the problem with the mind, again, is it only knows what we've put into it. So it's like a shot glass of knowledge sits in the mind, where there's an ocean of knowledge in the heart. But when we're stuck in the mind, and we've ran through our scenarios and our stories so many times, it sort of traps us in the body. And eventually, I think we get tired of our own antics. We get tired of our own stories, and we just sort of, but we don't know. When I started getting tired of my stories, you get kind of numb to them. You kind of get numb to life. It's like, this is a mundane existence.
Now, is it possible, by getting numb to your stories and the emotions that are attached to it, that potentially you could become numb to the emotions as well in other aspects of your life, not just what pertains to your stories?
Yeah, I think if we're engaging our emotions quite heavily, then that prevents us from getting numb to it. The emotions kind of give us that charge a lot of the times. I think it's more when we get stuck in the mind that we start to numb out, or the engagement of the emotion of sadness or resentment or fear or anger. Maybe we get a little burned out on that one. Maybe it becomes less traumatic.
Mm-hmm. And so is there a practical way to prevent our minds from determining outcomes and keeping us from being present? Is this just a simple matter of putting your mind down, as we've discussed earlier?
It is, and again, I keep saying this over and over. It's a practice. You practice holding your attention on what's around you. And another thing that helps in that is that we learn how to become innocent. And that's a real tool that sort of plunges us deeply into this moment. And it stops us from, it actually stops us from predetermining outcomes as well.
Something I want to talk about with that real quick. When we use the phrase the innocence of a child, for an example, there is likely no other human being that is more present than a child. Mm-hmm. Well, what's your definition of innocence? Because it's sort of a weird thing. It's like some people might say innocence is, well, you haven't done a bad thing yet consciously. Innocence is when you maintain good actions consciously. But is there more to it than that?
There's a lot more to innocence than that. That's the outward appearance of what innocence is.
Which is the common understanding of it, I think, right?
That's right. The inward answer of what innocent is because what we're seeing when somebody is truly innocent is we're seeing the pure radiance of your being. That's what real innocence is. It's when somebody is truly innocent, the radiance of their being is shining forth from them. I remember I had an apprentice, and I don't think she'll mind me saying, but Amy Allen, and her presence was such an innocent soul, and she had this certain beauty about her, and it was like not her physical beauty, but it was her innocence, and she really had this real special quality about her, and she still does to today. When I see Amy, I have such a reverence for her and such a deep appreciation and respect for her and her husband too. Her husband's a really wonderful man, Aaron Allen. Mm-hmm. So, but it's what innocence is. It's a reflection of you resting in your soul. When we're innocent, we're not caught in the mind casting judgments, projecting assumptions. We're not trying to control what we think things should or ought to be. We're just completely aware of the radiance of who we are, and we're completely present with this moment. And there's nothing more beautiful than innocence.
I wonder then, like, the innocence of a child, because you'd have to question how self-aware a child really is. Right? I don't know if they are.
And it doesn't really have to be a conscious awareness of you knowing your soul. It's just a being. Mm-hmm. It's more of a being than a knowing. That's the wonderful thing about aging is that if you can bring the innocence of a child into the wisdom of an elder, then you've got a really dynamite combination there.
Absolutely, man. Now, you talk about, in the book, how people typically interpret their environment and process it through two filters, the mind and your emotions, which are a very common theme here. What is filtered out of the raw experience of the moment due to those two filters?
Okay, so let's back up for 1 second and talk about how we process the moment, because I think this is a common understanding, but maybe people don't realize how this all works. Now, this is a classic, typical explanation, okay? So we process our environment, like you said, our emotional state, and then the contents of our mind. So in my book, I created this chart, and it shows we receive external stimula from the outside environment around us. So you are sitting here, you're my external stimula, and then we process that through our emotions and our mind. So my emotion, if I'm happy, I may perceive you as happier than you are. If I'm in a panic, I may perceive you to be panicked. Or if I'm relaxed, I may perceive you in a much different light. Then also, there's attitudes in the contents of your mind will be memories. So if I see you and you spit on me last time you saw me, I'm gonna have a real attitude from a memory that I have of you. And so our memories, our thoughts, and then our feelings, and our mood, all of that sort of colors what we're looking at. And we begin to filter out what we're actually experiencing. And this is again how, we need to, this takes us away from an authentic engagement with the moment at hand.
That's so interesting, what you just said. That's amazing stuff, because I'm really glad too that you rewound a little bit and broke that down for us, because it would be something to assume that everyone understands how their world affects them, and everything that's in their world, how they perceive that, process it through those two filters, and now project their assumption on what's sitting in front of them.
That's
when
right.
It might not be that whatsoever. That is incredibly fascinating.
If you just pulled a 24-hour shift, your emotional state's going to be different than if you just slept for 24 hours. Mm-hmm. So it colors your experience, and it changes how you filter what's going on. So what's filtered out of the raw experience is actually reality, the truth of what's actually happening. That's what gets filtered out. So going back to your question, what gets filtered out, and it's reality. We lose touch with what is. When we perceive the moment through our minds and our emotions, we completely lose touch with reality, because more often we're caught in our mind. So, and there's always this pull in the moment too, that we sort of pull ourselves out of the moment again and go into the mind. I remember one time I was giving a talk, and the person asked me, what's the big deal about the moment? I hear all this stuff about you should be in the moment, and who cares? Like, what's the big deal about the moment? And so on the spot, this whole teaching just popped in my mind. And I said, have you ever, imagine this, if you were to watch a movie and you watched 1 minute and then you fast forwarded 20 minutes, then watched another minute, fast forwarded 20 minutes. By the end of the average movie, you'd see 4 to 6 minutes. Okay? So on the average movie, if you only watched 4 to 6 minutes of that movie, how much would you really know about the movie? And the guy says, well, probably not very much. I said, exactly. That's what we do when we leave the moment. Or when our filters take a hold of what's happening and color and change it, we actually get sucked into our minds and our emotions, and we're actually out of the moment. And we do that in our life where we'll catch a minute of our day, and then we get caught in our mind or our emotions, and we blink out. We blink out to experience the past or the future, or just the chatter going on in our heads. And then we blink back in, and we capture another minute of our life. And if you continuously do this throughout your life, we greatly miss out on what's being offered to us. And that sort of kind of, it paints the picture to the reality of the life that I was living before I learned how to become mindful, before I learned how to authentically engage the moment. I was really missing out on a great deal of things. And what was happening for me is that my emotions were coloring so many events in shades that didn't fit. Okay, so if you say you came to me and you had a problem with something, and instead of me creating a solution, I would just add to the problem. And if it was a problem with me, I would have no tolerance for that. I'd be like, well, screw you. I'll get you. You're not going to get me. So my emotions would get rattled right away. And I was missing the moment. I was missing so many moments in my life because I was just caught in my mind experiencing the past.
Well, and think about through your actions, through your emotions, and the way that your mind is interpreting something, how you augment the future. Mm-hmm. Now that person has a different perspective on you and everything, and it's going to take a while before they can adjust back to another way in thinking and how they engage with you.
That's right.
Which then can create a cycle of the way that they then respond to you. You may see that for what it really is in the moment, and it just furthers your discontent for that person.
Yeah. I know there's experiences I've had in my past that people would say, Ned Burwell's spiritual. I'm actually an ordained minister now. That for someone from my past might think that's just absurd. That guy's a lunatic, and rightly so. In those periods of my life, I was a lunatic. I was pretty angry, and I was pretty colored by my emotions.
Life is an adventure, best understood by living it, one moment at a time.
So that's one way. That's how if we were to experience the moment simply through our mind and emotions, that's a very good explanation as to how we're seeing that in a different color through those filters. But then there's another way to experience the moment as well, and that's through our soul. And what I'm curious about is how that is achieved. Because I think, like, with what you're about to explain, this is what people are going to want to attain. And so we'll need to know how exactly we go about achieving that, and also what the significant benefits are to practicing that opposed to what we just discussed.
Okay, so this one here is actually a pretty big concept, and it's a lot for the mind to take in. Okay, so what I'm saying is that in the book, when I talk about we can interpret and process our environment through our soul, what I'm saying is that we can rest in our soul while we're processing our environments. Mm-hmm. Your soul has a different relationship with what's going on around you. So if we rest our attention and our focus in the soul, in our deep within ourselves, we have a different relationship with what's going on around us. Now, the relationship is different because my soul, as we talked about in the session 4 about love, we talked about my soul is made in the image, and it is God. So if the essence of my soul is actually God itself, it is part of everything outside of us. So the soul that resides in you, which is you, is the same piece of soul that's in you. It's in the next person, or it's in me, sorry. And my soul is actually part of all the objects in this house. If my soul comes from God, God is everything, God is the totality of all that is, then your soul is actually your enemy. It's part of your enemy. It reminds me of in the story about the Bhagavad Gita. It's a classic Indian text, and this story takes place on the battlefield. And there's Krishna and Arjuna. Krishna's the crown jewel of the Hindu gods. He's the number one guy. So they're on their way into battle, and Krishna pulls open his chest and he reveals the universe to Arjuna. And Arjuna's like speeding into battle, and he's about to kill all these people on the battlefield. And after Krishna reveals himself to Arjuna, Arjuna suddenly realizes that he and the people out that he's going to slaughter are one of the same. He and the people are one. They're his family. They're him. Now he's got to go out and kill himself. And he's in deep conflict over this. So that's him doing a monstrous act of killing. So, but when so I'm kind of stretching it a bit there, but when we process our environment through the soul, which is everything, then we don't have a conflict with what's going on. Even the negative or bad things that we deem bad happening around us, because we see ourselves in it. We see ourselves in anything that's happening around us. So the heart can't be in conflict with itself. If my heart is the divine and the divine is everything, how would my heart have a conflict with what's happening? Because it's me.
Right.
So here's the practice. You stay anchored in your heart, and you're rising above your mind and your emotions. You just take in what's around you. So this is a very real practice that you could put into play in your life. You just remain present with what's happening around you all the time. Resist the urge to have a commentary in your mind. Just witness what's going on without engaging your feelings. Because, we suddenly will start to have feelings. We'll feel something. And I would tend to go into my feelings and say, oh, I'm feeling this person is not a good person in front of me. And then I'd start thinking about that, and then I'd feel it further. So when we're processing our environment through our heart, we actually don't go into our feelings. We just watch our feelings like we're watching thoughts. And we allow the knowingness in our heart to arise. Without coaxing it or without a commentary, we just know. And so that's how we can process our environment and through the heart. And what that does is it makes our life more purposeful, because we start getting messages from the soul on what it is we're to do. We're surrendering in that moment to the soul. And when we surrender to the soul, it engages us deeply in what's actually going on. And we get a wider perception of what's going on. Big concept.
It is a big concept, but even if we look at it like the practice you just explained, and we just take that for what it is and just begin with that, it's actually very logical.
Yeah, and it's been a practice that I've been playing with for the last few years, and it makes life more interesting. It makes life, it removes my need to be at odds with the world around me, because there were so many things that when I was trapped in my mind and out of the moment, I found myself at odds with the world more often than I really wanted to be. And this removes that place of feeling like you're at odds with the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Now you mix that with critical thinking, common sense, because we still need that too. It's not to say that everything is glorious and that we, before we were just placing judgments on what we thought something was, because sometimes if we're processing through our minds and our emotions, you get a bad vibe off somebody, and maybe they are a bad person, not someone to be around. They might affect you in a way, and you become protective of yourself and defensive.
Yeah, don't let it color or change your engagement with what needs to unfold. So that's what that tattoo artist that I referred to a while back, the last session, how he was able to just sit in front of people that were criminals and have no judgment. He was just authentically engaging them.
That's specifically what I was referencing to, like what I was thinking about when I was saying that, because that is sort of like you had said, when you weren't privy to this information, the things you know today, that would have been a pretty foreign and out there thing for you to see. And like, how can you do that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you explained it very well, I think.
My engagement with my soul has changed my outlook on life. It's changed how I see and perceive the world greatly.
Now, there's a quote, too. This is in conjunction with what we're discussing here, but it reads, when you step into this moment now, you exit the temporal and enter into all of eternity. Can you explain that?
Yeah. This moment at hand, it extends backwards and forwards. We tend to think of this moment to be this suspended temporary little slice of time. What the moment is the totality of all of time, backwards and forwards. So this moment at hand is not a small sliver of many moments pieced together. Mm-hmm. There's actually only one moment, and it's here now. So this was a concept in my mind for a long time until it became my experience. And what I've noticed is that this moment here now, the future reaches back into it. And this moment here now, we can reach into the past from this moment. Mm-hmm. So the future can change this moment, and this moment can change the past. And we can change our future from this moment, and we can change our past from this moment. Now, if that doesn't rattle your mind, I don't know what would.
Yeah, for sure. Well, hold on. There was an example in the book about some students and some test grades.
That's right.
Do you want to use that as an example?
Yep. This concept first came to me a while back, and I was at a meditation retreat, and I went to go up to see my teacher, and I sit down on his porch, and he says, time isn't what you think it is. And I says, oh yeah? Really? What's the deal? And he's like, well, what you do now can change the past. And I'm like, what? That's just crazy. And that's absurd. And he's laughing. He thinks my teacher thought that was pretty funny. But he says, no, really. What you do now can change the past. This moment is not so temporary. And he says, but don't try to figure that out. You'll just drive yourself crazy. Well, you just let that go. It was almost like he had dropped a koan on me. And a koan is a Zen tale like that you've got to try to figure it out.
Okay. So
next thing you know, somebody ran up and they needed the Maharishi more than he needed to explain this concept to me. And so I walked away, and I'm shaking my head, scratching myself and thinking, how is this possible? Like he's got to have lost his marbles. Like, this moment now can't change the past. So for years, that kind of bounced around my mind, about 9 years. And then I was sitting at a second year psychology class at Western University. Mm-hmm. And the professor comes out the first day of the first class, and he says, guys, time isn't what you think it is. Well, my ears almost touched the ceiling. And because this is how Maharishi started out.
Yeah.
And he says, if you guys study after the exams, you'll do better during the exams. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I cannot believe he's saying this right now. Like, this is blowing my mind. I've been thinking about this for years.
Yeah.
So he goes on to talk about this study. And they had students study after the exam. They'd take an exam and then study after. They'd have students that studied before the exam and then take it. They'd have students that studied before and after the exam. And then they have students that didn't study at all. Now, when they did this test over and over and over again, the results were conclusive. The ones that studied after did better than the ones that didn't study at all. The students that studied before and after did the very best. Mm-hmm. So there is an empirical proof that if you study after an exam, you'll do better during. The proof was in the experiment. So this concept that this moment here changes the past is actually a reality. And we sort of skim over that reality because we're locked in the concept that we're moving forward in life. And that's so sometimes when life is random and it's just dropping things that we don't understand why, we'll say everything happens for a reason. And that just kind of coats the moment with a little bit of okay. We're okay with it.
Yeah, and everyone's heard that before. That is very common. Common thing.
Everything happens for a reason. So now we can accept the most random things that just don't fit life's scenario that's unfolding. Now, the explanation for why things happen in your life could be the reason when we say everything happens for a reason. So maybe the reason why some of these things happen is to support a later reality. Maybe the reason why the most random things will happen is it because that's your future showing up now. So if your future is showing up now, that means that in this moment, the past is changing. This moment is the past of your future. So your future is changing the past. So this moment here could be changing something that happens behind you, or what's already gone on in your life. Because you and I are sitting here now, maybe that's why I was your landlord at one point in your life. Maybe that's why, Amanda said, hey, there's a place for rent above the tattoo studio in Ingersoll. Maybe because of the fact that we're sitting here right now is why that happened. Had we have not decided to do this podcast, maybe you would have never lived above me. We just don't know. But our minds will assemble. These moments are going forward all the time.
Man, my head is just like, that's crazy, man. Mm-hmm. That's crazy to think that. Mm-hmm. Wow.
It's a deeper reality of what's happening here.
Yeah, that's wild, dude. I know that there's been times in life where just the strangest things happen. Mm-hmm. Like a long time ago, and then you come to where you are now in the moment, and then you look back on things and you're like, how perfect is that? Mm-hmm. Like, how perfect is that? Like, here's another example of something kind of like that. How I met Amanda. It was one night, and I called up a friend who I never call at the time, before, since, or after. This was the call. It was on a rainy night, and I called to see what he was up to. Mm-hmm. He said, not much. I was like, well, do you mind if I come over and hang out? He says, absolutely. So I go over there, and she was there. Mm-hmm. Right, and then I didn't see her for quite a while. But it's just one of those things where that is just so unlikely. And then when you see how she's affected me, you look at her qualities versus my qualities, you see like quite a balance there. Mm-hmm. And you just wonder, like, what was it that, when we were talking about angels earlier, was that a nudge to call? Because it was totally out of character for me to call. And also the circumstances of showing up at a friend's house who spoke nothing of two women there, that just seemed very random, right? But everything worked out so well. It's just very strange to me when I think back, like, what's the likelihood that I would have picked up the phone to call that person? This is a person I don't hang out with. Mm-hmm. I'm surprised I even had his phone number. I know we were doing some recordings and stuff at the time, but I never hung out with him, ever. So, like, that's just a really kind of strange thing. And what you were talking about with you being my landlord, and if we didn't do this podcast now, I might not have been your tenant. That's insane. That's so cool.
When I started to understand the concept and more in an experiential way. I started to experience how the future was showing up in the past, and so it started to make a lot more sense. And it doesn't, like, I don't care if no one agrees with this, or there's for me there's something to dig into there. And so now my mind works more in a circular fashion than a linear one. And I see that life is unfolding in a circular manner. You know, if we look at the Fibonacci sequence, it's in a spiral. It's life is how life, the mathematical equation for life and how life is growing and moving and changing, it works in a circle. You know, there's nothing linear about life. All
That's a
of
good
life,
point.
you know, is a circular motion. And sometimes different points of that, the continuum that completes one circle to the next circle in your life, there's many, many circles. You know, there's different points of that circle will show up, you know, in the moment you're in. And it doesn't mean it's just the reality of how things are unfolding. And we don't need to make sense of it in the mind. All we really need to do is stay anchored in our hearts and move from one moment to the next.
So in other words, it's not necessarily our responsibility initially to understand all of the concepts, but just understand the practice, which is fairly simple, right? I mean, that's not too out there.
That's
the
right.
Concepts are pretty wild if you're not used to hearing stuff like that.
I intentionally want to bend people's minds a little bit, just to kind of pull them a little bit, bring some elasticity back into the mind. You know, the mind is a wonderful tool to play with. It is a tool. We pick it up and we set it down. So, you know, I intentionally want to bend people's mind a little bit. You know, cause you to think outside of the box. Go from what you don't know into what you do. You know, there's different ways of processing your environment or processing knowledge. We can go from what we don't know to what we know, or we can go from what we absolutely know into what we don't know. And we tend to always just work it in the later way, where we take what we know and then we try to move it into what we don't know through what we know. But there's a more profound, I find it more profound in if I go from what I don't know first and then try to work it back into what I know.
Mm-hmm. So the last thing I want to touch on with this then, just to conclude and sort of summarize this last little bit of what we discussed, is if our mind doesn't have the capacity to fully grasp what is happening right now, which is highly likely, how do we experience the moment at hand?
With our heart, because it's open and it accepts what is. That's how we process the moment at hand. If you really want to experience the moment in its fullest, in all its glory, rest in your soul and witness it from that position. Or go into the stillness and witness this moment that's unfolding.
When you step into the moment now, you exit the temporal and enter into all of eternity.